The year is 1904. Allied bombers are turning German cities into rubble. Every day, hundreds of four-engine bombers, protected by swarms of fighters, rain destruction on the Third Reich. The German Luftwaffe, once dominant, is being systematically destroyed. Pilots are dying faster than they can be replaced. Aircraft factories are being bombed into oblivion. But in a concrete bunker beneath Bavaria, a revolutionary aircraft sits ready to change everything. It's the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, capable of speeds that make every Allied aircraft look like it's standing still. This should have been Germany's salvation in the air war. Instead, it became one of the most debated controversies of World War II. For decades, historians have argued about whether Hitler's interference with the Me 262 program cost Germany its last chance to regain air superiority. The story is far more complex than the simple narrative of a dictator's foolish meddling. It's a story of technological revolution, impossible engineering challenges, strategic desperation, and the harsh realities of total war. Let's start at the beginning, because understanding what Hitler actually said and did requires understanding what the Me 262 actually was and how it came to exist. In April 1939, before the war even started, the Messerschmitt Company began designing what would become the C-262. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of being powered by a traditional piston engine turning a propeller, this aircraft would use jet propulsion. The potential was obvious. Jet engines could theoretically push an aircraft to speeds far beyond what any piston engine could achieve. But the technology was completely untested. No one had ever built an operational jet fighter before. Germany was venturing into entirely unknown territory. The design team was led by Chief Engineer Waldemar Voigt, working under Messerschmitt as head of development, Robert Lusser. Their goal was ambitious. The Reich Air Ministry wanted a jet aircraft capable of 1 hour's endurance and a speed of at least 850 kilometers per hour. That speed would make it faster than anything else in the sky. The initial designs were drawn up in April 1939 and submitted in June of that same year. The basic configuration that emerged would define the aircraft throughout its development: a streamlined fuselage with 2 jet engines mounted in pods under swept wings. But here's where the problem started immediately. Germany had 2 companies developing jet engines: BMO with their 03 engine and Junkers with their 04 engine. Neither was ready. Neither had ever been mass-produced. Neither had been proven reliable. And most critically, both required exotic materials that Germany didn't have in abundance. The first prototype Me 262, designated V1, was ready by April 1941. But without working jet engines, the aircraft had to fly with a conventional Junkers Jumo 210 piston engine mounted in the nose, driving a propeller. This defeated the entire purpose. The plane was supposed to be a jet. Instead, it was test flying as a prop plane, just to validate the airframe design. In September 1941, BMW finally delivered their P3302 engines. They were fitted to the Me 262 V1, which still kept its nose-mounted piston engine as a backup. On March 25, 1942, test pilot Fritz Wendell attempted the first takeoff under jet power. Both BMW engines suffered compressor blade failures during the flight. Wendell had to land using only the piston engine. The jet program looked like it might be dead on arrival. But Junkers had been working on their own engine, the Jumo 0004. 2 pre-production units were delivered to Messerschmitt in June 1942. On July 18, 1942, Fritz Wendell took the Me 262 into the air for the first time, powered purely by jet engines. The flight lasted just 12 minutes, but it proved the concept worked. The Me 262 could fly on jets alone. However, getting an aircraft to fly once and making it combat-ready for mass production are vastly different challenges. And here's where we need to be very clear about something that often gets lost in discussions about Hitler and the Me 262. The engines were catastrophically unreliable. The Jumo's 04 turbojet was a marvel of engineering, but it was also a nightmare of practical operation. Early engines frequently needed replacement after a single flight. The turbine blades, spinning at incredible speeds and exposed to extreme temperatures, would elongate and deform through a process called creep. Germany didn't have access to the high-temperature alloys that would have solved this problem. They were forced to use steel protected only by aluminum coating. These engines would fail, often catastrophically, with frightening regularity. Here's a specific detail that shows just how bad this was. Pre-production Jumo 04 engines rarely ran for more than 10 hours before needing complete replacement. Think about that. 10 hours. Many training sorties were lost because engines flamed out mid-flight. Combat missions had to be cut short when engines started overheating. And replacing an engine wasn't a quick process either. It took at least 30 minutes just to remove a failed engine, never mind installing a new one and running all the necessary checks. By mid-1943, after extensive development work, Junkers engineers managed to get the Jumo 004A passing 100-hour test runs, with a time between overhauls of 50 hours. This was better, but still completely inadequate for sustained combat operations. And there was another problem. The 004A used substantial quantities of nickel, cobalt, and molybdenum, all strategic materials that Germany was desperately short of. The engine had to be completely redesigned. The 04B engine that eventually went into production was designed to use the minimum possible amount of these rare materials. Everything that could be made from ordinary steel was made from ordinary steel. This made the engine cheaper and faster to produce. It also made it far less durable. The production 04B engines that powered operational Me-262s had a nominal running life of just 25 hours. Some sources cite even lower figures, as low as 10 to 15 hours of actual operational life. Allied jet engines, by comparison, would eventually achieve hundreds of hours between overhauls. It wasn't until June 1904 that the engine design was considered stable enough to freeze for mass production. Not combat ready, not perfect, just stable enough that they couldn't wait any longer to start building them in quantity. By this point, Allied bombers had been devastating German cities for years. Now, while all these engine problems were being worked out, the airframe itself was going through continuous modifications. The first 4 prototypes used conventional tailwheel landing gear, the same basic configuration as piston engine fighters. But during testing, engineers discovered a critical problem. At takeoff, the jet exhaust would deflect off the runway, creating turbulence that negated the effect of the elevators. Test pilot Fritz Wendel solved this temporarily by tapping the brakes at takeoff speed to lift the tail out of the turbulence. But this wasn't a solution for operational pilots. The answer was to switch to tricycle landing gear with a nose wheel. The 5th prototype, V5, flew with fixed tricycle gear. The 6th prototype, V6, had fully retractable nose wheel gear. This solved the takeoff problem, but created new engineering challenges and added weight to the aircraft. The engines also created unexpected aerodynamic issues. Originally planned to be powered by the lighter BM Bayers 003 engines, the aircraft had to be redesigned when the heavier Jumo 004s became the primary power plant. The engines were so heavy that they threw off the plane's center of gravity. Engineers solved this by sweeping the wings back 18 degrees. This wasn't an aerodynamic choice for high-speed flight. It was a necessity to keep the aircraft balanced. The swept wings would later become iconic and influence post-war jet design, but they were initially just a fix for an engineering problem. Throughout 1942 and 1943, development continued slowly. The German High Command was skeptical. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, had cut the engine development program to just 35 engineers in February 1940. This was before the Battle of Britain had even begun. At that point, German leadership believed the war would be won with conventional aircraft. They saw no immediate operational need for jets. This skepticism was shared by many in the Luftwaffe itself. In 1942, when the Me-262 was making its early jet-powered flights, senior Luftwaffe officers regarded it as an interesting novelty with no immediate use. The main battlefronts were in North Africa and deep in the Soviet Union. There was no serious threat to Germany itself from daylight air attacks yet. The Focke-Wulf 1D and Messerschmitt 109 were handling what enemy aircraft did appear. Why divert resources to an experimental jet when proven piston fighters were doing the job? But by late 1943, the situation had changed dramatically. American heavy bombers were beginning sustained daylight raids deep into Germany. British bombers were hammering German cities by night. German fighters were shooting down bombers, but the Allies simply built more aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots at an unsustainable rate. On April 22, 1943, Major General Adolf Galland, the general of fighter forces, flew the Me-262 himself. Galland was one of Germany's top fighter aces and a skilled evaluator of aircraft. He was immediately convinced that the Me-262 represented the future of air combat. Its speed advantage was overwhelming. Allied fighters simply couldn't catch it. Allied bombers couldn't escape it. In Galland's view, this was exactly what Germany needed to regain air superiority. Galland later wrote that he would rather have one Me-262 than 5 Me-109s. He pushed hard for the aircraft to be developed as quickly as possible, but he was fighting against two massive problems: the engineering difficulties that kept delaying the program and the strategic thinking of Adolf Hitler. Now we come to the central controversy. What did Hitler actually want the Me-262 to be, and what did he actually say about it? The first documented meeting where Hitler expressed interest in the Me-262's capabilities happened in November 1943. Göring traveled to Augsburg to investigate whether the aircraft would be suitable as a fighter-bomber. On November 2, 1943, Göring visited the Messerschmitt facilities to examine the Me-262 personally. 3 weeks later, a formal demonstration was arranged at Insterburg Aviation Center for Hitler himself. At this demonstration in late November or early December 1943, Hitler asked a question that would have enormous consequences. Looking at the Me-262, he turned to those present and asked, "Can this aircraft carry bombs?" There are multiple accounts of exactly how this conversation went. According to David Irving's research, Messerschmitt himself stepped forward before anyone could stop him and answered, "Yes, my Führer, it can take a 1,000-kilogram bomb or two 500-kilogram bombs without a problem." This was technically true. The aircraft's structure could handle that weight, but Messerschmitt failed to explain, or was not given the opportunity to explain, all the complications involved. Converting the Me-262 into an effective bomber would require extensive modifications: bomb racks, bomb aiming equipment, possibly a second crew member to operate as a bombardier, extended range requirements. None of this could be done quickly. Hitler's response, according to multiple witnesses, was enthusiastic. "For years I have been asking the Luftwaffe for a fast bomber, which, whatever the enemy fighter defenses, is certain to reach its target. In this aircraft, which you tell me is a fighter, I see the Blitzbomber with which I will repulse the invasion in its initial and weakest phase." That word, Blitzbomber, literally meaning lightning bomber or bolt bomber, would become central to the entire controversy. Hitler had fixated on a specific concept. He envisioned Me-262s delivering devastating attacks on Allied invasion forces as they came ashore, striking fast before enemy fighters could respond, sowing panic and disruption that would allow German panzer divisions to crush the beachheads. It's important to understand Hitler's strategic thinking here, because it wasn't entirely irrational given what he knew and feared. By late 1943, everyone knew an Allied invasion of Western Europe was coming. It was just a question of when and where. Hitler understood that if this invasion succeeded in establishing firm beachheads, Germany would be fighting a two-front war against numerically superior forces. The invasion had to be defeated immediately in the first hours and days before the Allies could consolidate. Hitler had been obsessed with fast bombers for years. He had been asking for an aircraft that could penetrate enemy airspace regardless of fighter opposition, deliver its payload, and escape before being intercepted. In his mind, the Me-262 suddenly presented the solution he had been seeking. It didn't matter that the aircraft had been designed as a fighter. Its speed made it perfect for what he wanted. According to Albert Speer, then Minister of Armaments and War Production, Hitler had initially blocked mass production of the Me-262 even before this meeting. Hitler had been skeptical after the problems Germany had encountered with the Heinkel 177 bomber development program. He refused to fast-track the Me-262 project, allowing only technical testing of small numbers of prototypes with no preparation for mass production. Adolf Galland later estimated this caused a delay of about 6 months, on top of approximately 2 years of data from a 1940 order to postpone all research developments not immediately useful to the war effort. But after the Insterburg demonstration and Hitler's enthusiasm for the Blitzbomber concept, attitudes changed. On December 5, 1943, Göring issued an order explicitly stating, "The Führer wishes to draw our attention urgently to the enormous importance of the production of jet aircraft to be deployed as fighter bombers. It is imperative to ensure that by the spring of 1904, the Luftwaffe has a sufficient number of these fighter bombers operational. Now, here's something that often gets overlooked. Despite Hitler's enthusiasm for the bomber version, actual development and production of the Me-262 continued to focus on the fighter variant. Luftwaffe and manufacturing personnel essentially ignored Hitler's directive initially, treating it as a passing fancy. They continued developing the plane as a fighter. Small-scale production began with the fighter version. About 60 aircraft were built by the spring of 1904, all configured as fighters. This became a problem in late May 1944. Hitler held a conference on emergency aircraft programs at his headquarters at Berchtesgaden on May 23, 1904. When the Me-262 was mentioned, Hitler asked, "How many of the 262s already manufactured can carry bombs?" Field Marshal Erhard Milch answered honestly, "None, my Führer. The Me-262 is being developed exclusively as a fighter aircraft." According to every witness account, Hitler absolutely lost his composure. He flew into one of the most extreme rages anyone present had witnessed. He screamed at Milch, Göring, and the assembled Luftwaffe officers, accusing them of unreliability, disobedience, and unfaithfulness. He was furious that his explicit orders had been ignored. Adolf Galland described the scene. "Officers who were close to Hitler told me later that they had rarely witnessed such a fit of temper." Hours after this explosive meeting, Milch, Karl Heinrich Bodenschatz, Göring's liaison to Hitler, Wilhelm Messerschmitt, and Galland were summoned by Göring. He communicated Hitler's orders. The entire series of Me-262s was to be readjusted and rearmed as bombers. To avoid any future misunderstanding, Göring said, no one was to refer to the Me-262 as a fighter, or even as a fighter bomber. It was to be called only the Blitz bomber. On May 29, 1944, this edict was formalized. The Me-262 and the Arado 234 jet bomber were to be built exclusively as bombers, not fighters. Messerschmitt and Galland tried desperately to argue against this decision. They pointed out that German fighter pilots desperately needed this superior aircraft to defend the Reich. The arguments made complete sense from a military standpoint. But Göring would not take it to Hitler. He knew what the response would be. At that level, the subject was closed. Now, why was Hitler so adamant about this? The invasion he had been dreading was imminent. Just 2 weeks after this conference, on June 6, 1904, Allied forces landed in Normandy. Hitler's worst strategic nightmare was becoming reality. In his mind, the Me-262 bomber represented the weapon that could make the difference between repelling the invasion and facing a two-front war he couldn't win. The problem was that converting the Me-262 into an effective bomber was far more complicated than simply bolting on some bomb racks. The aircraft had to be modified to carry bombs. Pilots had to be trained in completely different tactics. Bombing techniques had to be developed. And all of this took time. Oberst Edgar Peterson, who had been head of the Reckland Test Center, later said he considered Messerschmitt's impetuous statement to Hitler at Insterburg a turning point in the air war. Messerschmitt had been technically correct that the aircraft could carry a 1,000-kilogram bomb, but he should have qualified his statement by explaining the time required to make the aircraft into a useful bomber. To carry heavy bombs effectively, the jet would have needed the more powerful Jumo 004C turbine, which was still on Junkers test rigs. During May and June 1904, while Germany was under increasing air attack, the Luftwaffe struggled to make a bomber out of the Me-262. Auxiliary fuel tanks were added to increase range. Bomb racks were installed, but fundamental problems emerged immediately. The Me-262 was too fast for conventional dive bombing. The pilot couldn't hold the aircraft on target at the speeds it naturally flew. Hitler recognized this problem and expressly forbade shallow angle dives or any speed exceeding 470 miles per hour. This meant the Me-262 had to bomb in level flight from high altitude, but bombing accurately from level flight at high speed was nearly impossible. The pilot sat over the wings and at high altitude had virtually no sight of ground targets. The aircraft had no bomb sight designed for jet speeds. Dropping bombs from a great height while traveling at over 400 miles per hour meant those bombs would miss their targets by huge margins. Pinpoint bombing was completely out of the question. Dietrich Peltz, who was assigned to organize bomber squadrons equipped with the Me-262, frankly told Göring about all these problems. How was the target to be hit? What would the pilot aim with? how would the bombs be dropped? The Me-262 couldn't dive bomb. Level flight bombing would need incredible luck to hit a field over a square kilometer in size. Peltz concluded, "If you ask me if the Me-262 can be a bomber, yes or no, I would say no. At least not without thorough preparation and probably completely new bomb sites." But Göring, anticipating Hitler's anger if he delivered such a depressing opinion, refused to listen. He told Peltz, "You know very well that it is the Führer's wish to use the Me-262 as a bomber, and it's your job to come up with something." So, work continued on the bomber variant despite all these fundamental problems. The first bomber unit, IG Gruppe of Kampfgeschwader 51, was equipped with Me-262s and ordered to France in July 1944. By the time they were ready to operate, the Normandy landings had succeeded and Allied forces were breaking out across France. The opportunity for Me-262 bombers to attack invasion beaches was long past. When Me-262 bombers did eventually fly missions, the results were exactly as pessimistic as Peltz had predicted. The unit lost 12 jets in 2 weeks for minimal returns. The bombs missed their targets. The aircraft, loaded with bombs and flying at altitudes where they could be caught by Allied fighters, were vulnerable. The Me-262's speed advantage disappeared when it was carrying external bombs and trying to fly precisely for bombing runs. Meanwhile, fighter pilots and aircraft designers were becoming increasingly desperate. Adolf Galland tried multiple approaches to change Hitler's mind. He asked officers who were attending Führer headquarters to receive awards to bring up the Me-262 in conversation, recommending it for Reich air defense. He organized demonstrations of the fighter version's capabilities. In mid-April 1904, a training unit for fighter Me-262s had been established at Lechfeld, south of Augsburg, commanded by Captain Werner Thierfelder. This unit became Erprobungskommando 262, a test and evaluation unit meant to develop tactics for the Me-262 as a fighter. Thierfelder was killed in July 1904, and Major Walter Nowotny took command. The unit was redesignated Kommando Nowotny. Nowotny was one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with 258 victories, almost all on the Eastern Front. He had the prestige and combat experience to develop effective tactics for the revolutionary jet fighter. But Kommando Nowotny faced overwhelming problems. The aircraft were unreliable, engine failures were constant, landing gear collapses were common, tires made from synthetic rubber would blow out on landing, sending aircraft careening off runways. On July 26, 1904, Lieutenant Alfred Schreiber, flying an Me-262A-1A, scored what was arguably the first jet fighter victory in history when he damaged a Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft. But these early successes were hard-won and sporadic. Kommando Nowotny mounted the world's first jet fighter operations, but progress was painfully slow. In August 1904, the unit began flying operational missions against Allied bomber formations. Between August and November, they claimed 19 Allied aircraft shot down, but lost 6 Me-262s. These numbers reveal the challenge they faced. Even with a revolutionary aircraft, they were achieving only modest results because of technical problems, inexperience with jet tactics, and sheer Allied numerical superiority. Then came a crucial shift in Hitler's thinking. On June 7, 1904, the day after D-Day, Hitler modified his stance slightly. Initial Me-262 production had to remain limited to the bomber version, but testing of the fighter version could continue as long as it didn't interfere with bomber production. This was a small crack in the absolute ban. On June 25, 1904, Hitler asked how many fighters could be produced each month if his 177 bomber production was suspended. When told about 1,000, Hitler made a significant decision. On June 27th, Göring ordered a halt to bomber production. When General Koller protested, Göring told him, "It is the will of the Führer that only fighters are to be built from now on." This was a major strategic shift in German aircraft production. But the Blitzbomber edict specifically regarding the Me-262 remained in force. Twice more, on July 20th and August 30th, General Krypy tried to get Hitler's agreement for exclusive deployment of the Me-262 as a fighter. Hitler brusquely refused both times. At the end of August 1904, Hitler circulated an edict throughout the Luftwaffe that every officer was required to sign. It read, "With immediate effect, I forbid anybody to speak to me about the Me-262 jet aircraft in any other connection or any other role than as a fast or blitz bomber." This wasn't just a preference, it was an absolute command backed by Hitler's authority. Officers were forbidden to even mention the Me-262 as a fighter in Hitler's presence. The political environment had become so charged that rational military discussion was impossible. But events were forcing reality to intrude on Hitler's vision. In September 1904, Patton's tanks had broken through in France after Operation Cobra. The strategic situation that had motivated Hitler's Blitz bomber obsession had evaporated. There were no invasion beaches to attack. France was being liberated. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Germany desperately needed fighters to defend the homeland. On September 1904, during a meeting where Adolf Galland and several other officers expressed their concerns about the Luftwaffe's situation, Galland managed to bring up the Me-262. He emphasized that trying to use the aircraft as a bomber was pointless, given Germany's current military situation. All the pilots and army officers agreed, but Hitler wouldn't discuss it. After so many attempts, Galland simply withdrew from the argument and focused on his own work. One particularly telling incident occurred when Galland was summoned to Hitler's presence to receive a decoration. During the conversation, Galland described recent air battles, where German fighters had suffered heavy losses despite shooting down enemy aircraft. Hitler attributed these losses to numerical superiority. This gave Galland an opening. Despite the August edict forbidding anyone to mention the Me-262 as a fighter, Galland carefully steered the conversation to Germany's need for aircraft with superior performance. He emphasized that quality could compensate for quantity, that restoring a sense of superiority in German pilots required better aircraft. Though he couldn't explicitly mention the Me-262 as a fighter, he was making his case as clearly as he dared. The turning point finally came in November 1944. On November 4th, Hitler finally approved full production of the Messerschmitt Me-262 as a fighter aircraft. But by then, as many observers noted, it was too late. Major Walter Nowotny was killed on November 8, 1944. He had taken off despite orders to stay grounded, engaging an American bomber formation at 30,000 feet. He claimed 2 P-51 Mustangs destroyed before suffering engine failure at high altitude. While diving and trying to restart his engines, he was attacked by other Mustangs. The exact circumstances of his death remain uncertain. He may have been hit by friendly anti-aircraft fire, shot down by American fighters, or simply lost control after his engine failure. Regardless, one of Germany's greatest aces was dead, and the Me-262 program lost a key advocate and tactician. After Nowotny's death, Commando Nowotny was withdrawn from operations. The pilots were sent for further training at Lechfeld. On November 19, 1904, the unit was redesignated as 3 Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 7, the first jet fighter wing in history. JG-7 was formed under the command of Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, with Major Erich Hohagen commanding the 3rd Gruppe. But JG-7 faced all the problems that had plagued Commando Nowotny, multiplied by the worsening strategic situation. Aircraft deliveries were irregular, fuel was scarce, spare parts were hard to obtain. Training accidents were common because the Me-262 was so different from anything pilots had flown before. 10 Me-262s were lost in training accidents in just 6 weeks. During its early operations, JG-7 could only mount tentative sorties, usually no more than 4 to 6 aircraft at a time. By the end of February 1945, the unit had claimed around 45s, 4-engine bombers, and 15 fighters shot down. These were significant successes on an individual level, but they had no effect whatsoever on the Allied air offensive. The Allies were putting 1,000 bombers and 1,000 fighters over Germany on major raids. Even successful Me-262 attacks represented a tiny fraction of the attacking force. March 1945 saw JG-7 finally able to mount larger attacks. On March 3rd, they flew 29 sorties and claimed 8 kills for the loss of 1 jet. On March 18th, they achieved their biggest single attack. 37 Me-262s intercepted a force of 1,221 American bombers and 632 escorting fighters. This action also marked the first use of the R-4M air-to-air rockets, unguided missiles that could be fired from outside the range of bomber defensive guns. In this massive engagement, the Me-262s claimed 12 bombers and 1 fighter destroyed for the loss of 3 jets. This was a 4-to-1 kill ratio, exactly what the Luftwaffe needed. But in absolute terms, it was insignificant. Those 12 bombers represented only 1% of the attacking force. In 1943 and early 1904, the Americans had sustained loss rates of 5% and continued operations. The few available Me-262s simply couldn't inflict sufficient casualties to hamper Allied bombing. On April 7, 1945, JG-7 flew 59 sorties, their largest number in a single day. Most failed to engage the Allies. They claimed 5 aircraft destroyed for the loss of 2 jets. On April 10th, elements of JG-7 and other units sent 59 Me-262s against American formations, coordinating with the desperate Sonderkommando Elbe attack, where Bf-109 pilots attempted to ram American bombers. The jets claimed 18 victories, but 27 Me-262s were lost, almost half of those committed. The last Me-262 aerial combat of World War II in Europe occurred at 4 p.m. on May of 1945, the day Germany surrendered. Oberleutnant Fritz Stahle and his wingman took off to intercept Soviet Yak-9 fighters and encountered them over Freiburg. Steele claimed a Yak-9 destroyed, though Soviet records indicate the aircraft was actually a P-39 Era Cobra. 2 Soviet pilots were killed. This final victory, occurring even as Germany was officially surrendering, symbolized both the Me-262's potential and its tragic irrelevance. Throughout the Me-262's operational career, the aircraft demonstrated clear superiority when it could engage on its terms. German pilots fawning Me-262s claim 42 Allied aircraft destroyed, though higher numbers have sometimes been cited. The real losses were probably lower, as overclaiming was common on all sides. But even taking the most conservative estimates, the Me-262's combat record was impressive given how few were operational at any time. The problem was never the aircraft's capability when it was working properly. The problem was that it was rarely working properly, and there were never enough of them. About 400 Me-262s were manufactured in total. Only about 200 to 300 ever saw combat. There were probably never more than 36 in the air simultaneously when the Allies routinely put 1,000 bombers and 1,000 fighters over Germany. So, did Hitler's insistence on the bomber version delay and cripple the Me-262 program? The answer is complex and has been debated by historians for decades. The traditional narrative, repeated in many histories, is straightforward. Hitler's stupid obsession with turning a fighter into a bomber cost Germany 6 months or more of development time, preventing the Me-262 from entering service when it could have made a difference. Adolf Galland himself supported this view, stating in his memoirs that Hitler's bomber fixation delayed introduction of the Me-262 into the fighter role by 6 months, depriving Germany's air defense of a desperately needed weapon. Albert Speer wrote that Hitler's interference was a major factor in preventing large-scale deployment of the Me-262 as a fighter. But more recent analysis by historians like Alfred Price has challenged this narrative. Price's detailed examination of the Me-262's development timeline concludes that Hitler's edict delayed the introduction of the Me-262 into fighter service by only about 3 weeks, not 6 months. Here's the evidence for this revisionist view. The real limitation on Me-262 production wasn't Hitler's bomber order, it was the engines. Production Me-262 airframes were coming off assembly lines in the spring of 1904, but they couldn't be completed because there were no engines. The Jumos 04 wasn't ready for mass production until June 1944. It wasn't until August 1904 that the average running life of the engine reached 25 hours, the bare minimum considered acceptable for freezing the design. By September 1904, when Hitler rescinded his order that all Me-262s be delivered as fighter bombers, more than 100 fighter airframes were already sitting around without engines. As soon as 04s became available, these aircraft were completed and delivered to the Luftwaffe. In this view, Hitler's interference complicated the program and created confusion, but it didn't fundamentally delay production. The delay was caused by the engines, which would have prevented mass production regardless of what role the aircraft was intended for. There's another factor that supports this view. The modifications required to make the Me-262 into a bomber variant were actually relatively minor. Bomb racks could be fitted in the field. Early production aircraft were delivered with both the capability to carry bombs and full fighter armament. The A-2A bomber variant simply had 2 of its 4 cannons removed for weight balance. but retained two 30mm cannons, making it still formidable against enemy aircraft. The real problem with the bomber variant wasn't the modifications. It was that using the Me-262 as a bomber was fundamentally ineffective. The aircraft couldn't bomb accurately. The speed that made it a superb fighter made it a poor bomber. Loading it with bombs reduced its speed advantage and made it vulnerable. But these operational failures didn't delay the fighter version. They just wasted aircraft and pilots that could have been used more effectively. So, why has the narrative of Hitler's catastrophic interference persisted? Partly because it's a convenient explanation that fits a broader pattern of Hitler making disastrous military decisions. Partly because respected figures like Galland and Speer promoted this view. And partly because the timeline is confusing enough that it's easy to assume the bomber program caused delays. But there's also a psychological factor. After the war, many German officers had an incentive to blame Hitler for everything that went wrong. The Me-262's failure to save Germany became another item on the list of Hitler's mistakes. This deflected responsibility from the Luftwaffe leadership and from the engineers who struggled with the technical problems. However, even if Hitler's direct orders only caused a 3-week delay rather than a 6-month delay, his indirect influence was still significant and damaging. First, Hitler's skepticism and lack of interest in the program earlier in the war definitely slowed development. The 6-month delay Galland mentioned from Hitler's refusal to fast-track the project in 1943, plus the 2-year delay from the 1940 order to postpone non-essential research, had nothing to do with the fighter versus bomber question. These were separate decisions driven by Hitler's general underestimation of the jet program's importance. Second, Hitler's bomber fixation created confusion and wasted effort at a critical time. Engineers and pilots spent months working on bombing techniques and modifications that proved useless. Training time was diverted. Resources were allocated inefficiently. The psychological impact of the Führer edict forbidding mention of the Me-262 as a fighter created a toxic command environment where rational discussion was impossible. Third, Hitler's insistence on the bomber role led to the first operational Me-262 units being bomber units rather than fighter units. A Gruppe of KG-51 was equipped with fighter-bomber Me-262s and suffered heavy losses for minimal effect. If those aircraft and pilots had been in fighter units from the start, they might have achieved more. Fourth, the political battle over the aircraft's role distracted from solving the real problems. While Galland was trying to maneuver around Hitler's edict and Göring was trying to avoid Hitler's wrath, nobody was addressing the fundamental issues of engine reliability, landing gear failures, and pilot training. There's also the question of whether Hitler's strategic concept was inherently flawed. Defenders of Hitler have argued that his idea of using Me-262s against the invasion beaches wasn't irrational. A few dozen jet bombers striking the beaches on D-Day, causing chaos among troops and equipment struggling to get ashore, might have made a difference. The D-Day landing succeeded, but they were far closer to failure than is often remembered, particularly at Omaha Beach, where American forces nearly failed to secure a beachhead. However, this defense ignores several realities. First, there was no way the Me-262 could have been ready in time for D-Day, even if Hitler had fully supported it as a fighter from day one. The engines weren't ready. The aircraft wasn't ready. Second, even if a few Me-262 bombers had attacked the beaches, their impact would have been minimal. Without effective bomb sights, flying at high altitude to avoid fighter interception, they would have missed most of their targets. Third, Allied air superiority was so overwhelming by June 1904 that operating Me-262s from bases in France would have been nearly impossible. The concrete runways they needed would have been prime targets for Allied fighter bombers. The fundamental strategic problem was that by 1904, Germany had already lost the war. No single weapon system, however revolutionary, could change the outcome when Germany was being crushed by the combined industrial might of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire. The Me-262 was a tactical marvel that might have achieved local successes, but it couldn't address Germany's strategic catastrophe. If we look at the cold numbers, they tell the story clearly. Even in March 1945, when JG-7 was finally operational in significant numbers and achieving impressive kill ratios, they were claiming about 12 bombers in their largest attack. On that same day, the Americans launched 121 bombers. The Germans would have needed to shoot down hundreds of bombers per mission, sustaining those loss rates for weeks to actually stop the bombing campaign. They would have needed not 200 operational Me-262s, but thousands of them, with reliable engines, adequate fuel, trained pilots, and defended bases. None of that was achievable by 1945. Let's talk about the operational realities that made the Me-262 less effective than its raw performance suggests. The engines required careful handling. Rapid throttle movements could cause compressor stalls or flameouts. At low speeds, particularly during takeoff and landing, the aircraft was vulnerable and the engines provided insufficient thrust. Allied pilots quickly learned to patrol over Me-262 bases and attack the jets as they tried to land when they were slow and low on fuel. The Germans countered by installing flak alleys of anti-aircraft guns along approach paths to Me-262 bases, and by providing top cover with conventional fighters like the F-190D and TA-152. But this required coordination, resources, and fuel, all of which were in short supply. Many Me-262s were destroyed on the ground by Allied fighter-bomber attacks on their bases. The aircraft also suffered from high accident rates. Landing gear failures were common. The nose wheel was particularly prone to collapse. Tires made from synthetic rubber would fail on landing, especially given the Me-262's high landing speed of around 100 knots, much faster than piston-engine fighters. A heavy landing could cause a tire blowout, sending the aircraft careening off the runway. Pilot training was another critical bottleneck. The Me-262 required completely different flying techniques than anything pilots had experienced. The slow throttle response, the different energy management, the high speeds, all demanded new skills. But by 1904 to 1945, Germany lacked the time, fuel, and safety margins to properly train pilots. Many pilots made their first jet flight in a single-seat Me-262 without an instructor, because the two-seat trainer variant was largely unavailable. Lieutenant Walter Hagenau, who converted to the Mi-262 in early 1945, described the inadequacy of the training he received. Our ground school lasted one afternoon. We were told of the peculiarities of the jet engine, the danger of flaming out at high altitude, and their poor acceleration at low speeds. That was it. One afternoon of ground school, then fly this revolutionary aircraft in combat against overwhelming enemy forces. The fuel situation was also critical. By 1945, Allied attacks on German synthetic fuel plants had severely reduced available aviation fuel. Me-262s sat on the ground not because of engine problems, but because there was no fuel to fly them. This was particularly bitter for Luftwaffe pilots who had the most advanced fighter in the world but couldn't use it. There's one more factor worth considering. Even if everything had gone perfectly, even if Hitler had fully supported the fighter version from day one, even if the engines had been reliable, even if there had been adequate fuel and trained pilots, would the Me-262 have actually changed the outcome of the war? Consider what would have been required. The Me-262 would have needed to be operational in large numbers by mid-1943, when the Allied bombing campaign was still building up, and before Allied air superiority was complete. It would have needed to achieve and sustain loss rates of 10% or more against Allied bomber formations. It would have needed to do this for months, forcing the Allies to either abandon or drastically curtail daylight bombing. But by mid-1943, the Me-262 wasn't ready. The engines weren't reliable enough. The airframe still had bugs. Even if Hitler had personally driven the program with absolute priority, the technical challenges would have prevented operational deployment before early 1904 at best. And by early 1904, even if Me-262s had been available in numbers, the Allies would have adapted. They were already developing their own jet aircraft. The British Gloster Meteor flew in 1943 and entered service in 1944. American jet programs were underway. The technological advantage the Me-262 represented would have lasted months, not years. Furthermore, destroying bombers was only one part of the air war. The Me-262 was an interceptor. It was less effective against the Allied fighters that were destroying German aircraft on the ground, strafing trains and vehicles, and grinding down the Luftwaffe in daily combat. The Allies would have concentrated on destroying Me-262s on the ground, attacking their bases, and using their vast superiority in conventional fighters to wear down the jet units. This is not to say the Me-262 was irrelevant. It absolutely was not. It was the first operational jet fighter in history. It proved that jet propulsion was the future of military aviation. It influenced post-war aircraft design fundamentally. Captured Me-262s were extensively studied by the Americans, British, French, and Soviets. The swept-wing design influenced everything from the MiG-15 to the F-86 Sabre. The lessons learned from the Jumo 04 engine informed jet engine development for decades. On an individual level, the Me-262 was revolutionary. Pilots who flew it described the experience in almost mystical terms. The smooth power of the jets, the incredible acceleration, the speed that made Allied fighters seem to be standing still. When everything worked, when the engines didn't flame out, and the landing gear didn't collapse, and the pilot knew what he was doing, the Me-262 was the most formidable fighter in the world in 1944 and 1945. But in the context of total war in 1945, the Me-262 arrived too late, and in too few numbers to matter strategically. Whether Hitler's interference added 3 weeks or 6 months to its development schedule is almost beside the point. The Allies' overwhelming industrial and numerical superiority would have crushed Germany regardless. So, what can we conclude about Hitler's role in the Me-262 story? Hitler's recorded statements show he genuinely believed the Blitzbomber concept was Germany's answer to the invasion threat. His repeated insistence on this role wasn't arbitrary madness. It was based on his strategic assessment of Germany's situation. He was wrong, but he wasn't crazy. Hitler's earlier skepticism and lack of support for jet development did delay the program, probably more significantly than his bomber fixation. The 6-month delay from his refusal to fast-track development in 1943 and the years lost from the 1940 research postponement hurt the program more than the fighter-bomber controversy. The direct delay caused by Hitler's May 1904 order to produce only bomber variants was probably relatively short, possibly as little as 3 weeks, because engine production was the real bottleneck. But the confusion, wasted effort, and toxic command environment created by his edict had broader negative effects. Hitler's interference was damaging and counterproductive, but it wasn't the main reason the Me-262 failed to save Germany. The main reasons were fundamental technical problems with the engines that took years to partly solve, shortages of critical materials, inadequate pilot training time and resources, fuel shortages, overwhelming Allied numerical superiority, and the basic reality that Germany had already lost the war by the time the Me-262 entered service. The Me-262 has become a symbol of Germany's late-war technological achievements and of the wonder weapons that Hitler believed could reverse Germany's fortunes. It represents both the remarkable ingenuity of German engineers and the ultimate futility of technological solutions to strategic disasters. If the Me-262 had entered service a year earlier, in mid-1943 instead of mid-1904, it might have significantly impacted the air war over Germany. It might have forced the Allies to suspend daylight bombing temporarily while they adapted tactics and developed countermeasures. It might have given Germany breathing room. But even this is speculative. The technical problems were so severe that operational deployment in 1943 was probably impossible regardless of political support. The final irony is that both Hitler's supporters and critics may be partly right. Hitler's interference with the Me-262 program was real and damaging. His Blitzbomber fixation wasted time and resources on a strategically useless concept. His absolute prohibition on discussing the aircraft as a fighter created an environment where rational military judgment was impossible. These were serious mistakes that reflected the dysfunctional command structure of the Third Reich. But Hitler's critics who claim the Me-262 could have won the air war if only he hadn't interfered were also wrong. The idea that the Me-262 was a war-winning weapon, hobbled by Hitler's stupidity, is comforting for those who don't want to confront the massive technical, industrial, and strategic challenges Germany faced. It suggests that Germany could have won, or at least avoided total defeat, if only one decision had been different. This is false. The Me-262 was a remarkable aircraft that arrived too late. in too few numbers, with too many technical problems, to make a strategic difference. Whether Hitler helped or hindered its development, the basic equation wouldn't have changed. By 1904, Germany was being crushed by enemies with vastly superior resources. No single weapon could change that reality. The story of Hitler and the Me-62 is ultimately a story about the limits of technology in war. Advanced weapons matter, but they don't trump basic strategic realities like industrial capacity, resources, trained personnel, and numerical superiority. The Me-62 showed what was possible with jet propulsion, and that was enormously important for the future of aviation. But in the context of World War II, it was too little, too late. What Hitler actually said about the Me-62 reveals a leader grasping for salvation in technology, convinced that one revolutionary weapon could reverse disasters caused by strategic miscalculation and industrial weakness. He saw the jet fighter and imagined it could be the Blitz bomber that would destroy the invasion he dreaded. He was wrong about that, but his error was just one among many that led Germany to defeat. The Me-262's failure to save Germany wasn't because Hitler said the wrong thing at the wrong meeting. It was because by the time this revolutionary aircraft was ready, the war was already lost.